Welcome to Shahnameh, Book of Kings. Today we begin with the Reign of Ardeshir. For his part, Ardeshir reached the shore of a wide body of water, where he prayed, "Sole source of help, who has made me safe from my malevolent enemy, I pray that his body may never know health again." Then he rested, and he talked with the ferryman there for a long time about the past. The ferryman, who was a wise old man, stared at Ardeshir's face and stature and realized that he must be descended from the Kynid kings. The prince's far and glory delighted him. Quickly he ferried Ardeshir across the water, and when the young man reached the other side and news of his coming spread, an army of supporters gathered there. Babak's men from Esteker came overjoyed at the news of their king, and all Dara's descendants came to him from the various provinces where they ruled. Joy at King Ardeshir's presence made old men's hearts young again, and band by band men poured in from the river valleys and mountains. Wise counselors came from every city and gathered about the ambitious youth. He addressed his followers, "Illustrious and righteous as you are, there is no one here who has not heard what the malevolent seconder, out of the baseness of his heart, did on this earth. One by one he killed my ancestors and unjustly grasped the world in his fist. Since I am descended from Esfandiar, it is right that I cannot recognize Ardavan as king here. If you are with me in this, I shall not let anyone usurp the title and throne that should be mine. What do you say? What is your answer? Tell me clearly." Everyone there, whether a warrior, a counselor, rose to his feet, and together they spoke from their hearts. "Those of us who are from Babak's tribe rejoice to see your face, and those of us who are Sasunians will bind on our sword belts to serve you in war. Our souls and bodies belong to you. Our joys and sorrows depend on you. Your lineage on both sides is nobler than anyone's. Kingship and heroism are your birthright. If you give the order, we shall make mountains level with the plains, and with our swords we shall make oceans water into blood." At such an answer, Ardeshir's mind outsoared the spheres of Venus and Mercury, and he thanked the nobles gathered there and mediated war in his heart. At the edge of the water he built a city which became the site of his preparations for war. A priest there said to him, "O fortunate and inspiring king, renewer of the monarchy, you must cleanse the province of Pars, and your star is still young. Of all those they call the kings of the people, he is the richest, and besides, he has harassed and harried you. You must get rid of Ardavan. Once you have removed him from power, no one will have the strength to offer you any resistance." This was what he had said to him, and Ardeshir was happy to hear such words. As the sun rose above the mountain peak, he left the shore and set off for Esteker. But when the news reached Bahman, Ardavan's son, his soul darkened and his heart filled with pain. He did not sit idly on the royal throne, but at once mustered his troops and prepared for war. There was a nobleman called Sabak, a just and well-meaning man in charge of armaments and troops, who ruled over the town of Joram. He had 7 fine sons. When he heard what was afoot, he defected from Bahman's side and ceremoniously brought his army with its war drums beating to join the forces of Ardeshir. As was customary, he dismounted and ran forward to kiss Ardeshir's feet. The ambitious young king made much of him and acknowledged the value of his prompt defection. But he was suspicious of Sabak, and in his heart he feared him. He was guarded with him as they marched, aware of the might of Sabak's large army. But Sabak was old and experienced, and he realized what Ardeshir was thinking. He came to the commander with the Zend Avesta in his hand and said, "I swear by Almighty God that Sabak's life is worthless if my heart is not blameless towards you. When I learned King Ardeshir was gathering troops on that shore, I became disgusted with Ardavan, just as a young man will be disgusted by an old woman. Consider me as a kind, patient, trustworthy slave who will bring you good luck. Hearing this, Ardeshir changed his mind about Sabak. He thought of him henceforth as his father, and placed him in command of his other officers. When his heart was freed from anxiety, Ardeshir paused at the fire temple of Ram Korad. There he prayed earnestly to God to guide him, to give him victory in all his undertakings, and to allow the tree of greatness to flourish for him. Then he returned to his pavilion, where his officers and men awaited him. He distributed cash to his troops, invoking God as he did so. His army was now like a valiant leopard, and he advanced against Bahman, the son of Ardavan, to give battle. As the two armies approached one another, each side formed ranks ready for battle, with lances and Indian swords grasped in their hands. Then they fell on one another like warring lions, and blood was spilled in rivers. So they fought until the sun turned pale, and the air was filled with dust, the ground with corpses. At dawn the next morning, when the sky's veil turned the color of turquoise, Sabak's troops entered the fray. A wind sprang up, and the dust made the air like pitch. Ardeshir attacked from the center, and such was his might and the strength of his fire that he slew many men with his mace. Bahman fled before him, his body wounded with arrows, and his soul shrouded in darkness. King Ardeshir pursued him relentlessly, with trumpets sounding and arrows raining down, until they reached the city of Estekar, the seat of Bahman's power. At the sound of Ardeshir's voice, he distributed to them the wealth that Bahman had toiled to accumulate. Scattering the hoarded coins, strong and confident, he led his armies out of Pars. The news of Bahman's defeat brought terror to Ardavan's heart, and his soul darkened. He said, "A man who knew the secrets of turning heavens once said to me that whenever an evil surpasses our imagination, our efforts can have no effect on our fate. I would not have thought that Ardeshir could become so ambitious or turn into a conqueror of cities." He opened his treasury doors, distributed provisions, mustered his army, and set off. He led his men through Jilin and Dalam, and dust they set up ascended to the moon. And on the other side, Ardeshir too pressed forward. His men were so numerous they stopped the wind in its tracks, and the columns resounded with the blare of trumpets and bugles, the jangling of bells, and the clashing of Indian cymbals. The armies were now 2 bowshots from one another, and the very snakes in the ground cowered away in terror. When a roar the columns attacked, their banners bravely fluttered, their swords lopping off heads, empurpled with blood. The fight lasted for 40 days. The common soldiers were hard-pressed. Their provisions ran out, and it was difficult to resupply them. So many corpses were piled there that the plain seemed like a mountain, and the wounded despaired of life. Finally, a wind sprang up, and a black cloud that made it impossible to fight spread over the armies. The mountainside groaned, and the ground shook, and the noise re-echoed in the heavens. Ardeshir's army was terrified. They all believed that this was a sign from God against their king Ardavan, and that there was nothing to do for their forces now but weep. On that day, the tide of battle turned against them, and they all surrendered. Ardeshir advanced from the center of the troops through the clash of weapons and a hail of arrows. Ardavan, who had devoted his sweet soul to the crown, was captured by a man named Kared, who seized the bridle and dragged him before the king. Ardavan dismounted before Ardeshir, wounded and despair. Ardeshir turned to his executioner and said, "Take that enemy of the king and split him open with a sword. Fill the hearts of those who plot against us with terror." The man came forward, and as he did as he had been ordered, and so this illustrious ruler was lost to the world. The ancient heavens turn, kings disappear. Now Ardavan is gone, now Ardeshir. And though their heads reach to the stars, they must at last be humbled in the lowly dust. The humiliation of the family of Arash was increased by the capture of 2 of Ardavan's sons. Their legs were bound, and the king gave orders that they be imprisoned. The eldest sons fled from the battlefield and escaped capture. Weeping, they fled to India, and theirs is a story worth recounting. The whole battlefield was strewn with horse gears, baldricks, weapons, and gold and silver objects. The king had all this collected and then distributed to his soldiers. Sabak left the other chieftains and cleansed Ardavan's body of blood. Weeping, he wiped away the grime of battle and made him a tomb suitable for a king. He wrapped the wounded body in brocade and placed a pillow of camphor beneath his head. But when the soldiers went on to Ray, they trampled the dust of Ardavan's palace beneath their feet. Then Sabak came back before Ardeshir and said, "Wise king, demand Ardavan's daughter in marriage. She has splendor and beauty and the dignity of her station. The crown and wealth for Ardavan took such trouble to accumulate. It will all be in your hands." Ardeshir accepted his advice, and he immediately demanded the girl for marriage. He stayed 2 months in her apartments. He was now a mighty commander and a mighty king. Then he went his way from Ray to Pars, having rested from battle and the world's strife. He built a town there sloped with palaces and gardens, streams, open spaces, and mountain slopes. A wise old dignitary still refers to that place as Ardeshir, the glory of Ardeshir. From an inexhaustible spring of water within the town he led off streams and irrigation channels. Near the spring he built a fire temple, and there he celebrated the Zoroastrian festivals of Mirgan and Sadai. Around the temple there were gardens, open spaces, and palaces. He made it into a splendid place. When later this wise and powerful king had died, the lord of the marches there called the place the city of Gur. Ardeshir built villages around it and settled the area. Although there was a deep lake nearby, it was separated from the town by a mountain. Ardeshir had laborers back 100 channels through the rock with picks, so that the water from the lake irrigated Gur, which became filled with buildings and livestock. Ardeshir led a huge army out from Estekar to fight against the Kurds. He sought aid from God in his expeditions to spill the blood of those thieves. But when he entered Kurdish territory, a numberless host welcomed him with war. An expedition that should have borne a minor matter became difficult, because the whole countryside supported the Kurds, so that they outnumbered the king's men 30-1. They fought a whole day till nightfall, when the king's army fled, and the battlefield was crowded with so many corpses that one could hardly move. Only a few soldiers remained behind with their king, and they were tormented with thirst because of the dust and the heat of the sun. Then night spread its banner and put an end to the fighting and tumult. Ardeshir saw a fire on the mountainside. He and his companions made their way up to it, and as they drew near, they saw a few shepherds there. Watching their sheep and goats, he and his soldiers dismounted, and their mouths were filled with the dust of battle. Ardeshir immediately asked for water, which the shepherd gave him, together with some yogurt. He rested and ate a little of what was before him. Then he spread out his army to sleep on, and his pillow was his royal helmet. Dawn broke over the lake, and the king of Persia lifted his head from the sleep. The chief of the shepherds came to his pillow, saying, "I wish you lucky days and nights. How is it that you've come here, as there is no place for someone like you to sleep?" The king questioned him about the way, and where he could find a place to rest. The shepherd answered, "You won't find any houses, unless you have a guide. But about 4 parasangs from here, there is a place where you could rest, and from there you should go from village to village until you reach the one where the local headman lives." Ardeshir took a few of the older men there as guides, and made his way to the village where the headman was. From there he sent horsemen, young and old, to Ardeshir, where the army heard of his escape. They were overjoyed, and set out to come to his aid. Meanwhile, Ardeshir posted spies, who quickly reported back that the Kurds were reveling in their success, and giving no thought at all to the king. They thought that his luck had grown old and feeble, and that he had gone back to Esteker. The king was happy to hear this, and soon forgot his recent reverses. He selected 30,000 cavalry from the army that had joined him, as well as 1,000 archers. As the sun grew yellow in the west, he led his army out, leaving behind those unfit for the march. By the time half the night had passed, and it was pitch dark, Ardeshir was close to the Kurds. The whole plain was filled with sleeping men, lying here and there, careless of their safety. He drew his sword, slackening his grip on the reins, and charged the Kurds' camp. The grass was covered with their blood, and the plain was filled with their severed heads and limbs, and heaps of dead were dreadful to see. A huge number of them were taken prisoners. Their violence and stupidity had been humbled. Ardeshir turned the country over to his soldiers for plunder, and distributed purses of gold and crowns to them. The countryside there became too secure because of Ardeshir's rule that an old man could have walked across the plain with a salver of gold coins on his head, and no one would have so much as looked at him. Ardeshir did not stay to enjoy the fruits of war, but hurried back to Esteker, where he gave orders that the men's horses were to be tended, and their armor was to be repaired. He told his soldiers to rest and enjoy themselves, since the time for warfare would come again quickly enough. His warriors feasted and rested, while Ardeshir's thoughts were of war. Consider this strange story revealed by a local dignitary, telling old, obscure tales. There was a poor but populous town called Kajaran, near the Persian Gulf, where all the inhabitants lived by their own efforts. A number of girls who had worked for their livelihood lived there. To one side of the town was a mountain where the girls would go together, taking cotton and spindles made of poplar wood. Traveling in a group through the realm down to the town gate, they would make their way to a mountain slopes, taking just enough food with them. But there was a little talk of eating or resting, since the sole concern was the cotton they'd brought to spin. Then they would return to the homes of nightfall, bringing the yarn they had spun. In this needy but cheerful place there was also lived a man called Haftvad, who had 7 sons, as his name indicates. He had a fine daughter, too, but he took no notice to her. One day, the group of girls was sitting on the mountainside with their needles, which they had set aside for a moment when they were eating. Just at that moment, Haftavad's daughter found a windfall apple lying on the ground, and she picked it up. Now, listen carefully, because this story's quite extraordinary. She bit the apple, but she tried it. She saw a little worm there coiled inside it. She scooped it out and gently found a place for this little worm inside her spindle case. And as she took her cotton up, she said, "By God, I swear today I'll spin such thread, helped by this apple's lucky worm, that you will be amazed at all I can do." The girls began to laugh in their delight. Their faces glowed, their teeth shone silver white. But that day, she spun twice as much as she normally did. She marked the amount on the ground, and she ran like wind-borne smoke to show her mother how much she had completed. Her mother smiled and congratulated her and said, "You've done well by your mother, my pretty one." The next morning, the girl took twice as much cotton as usual, and when she had rejoined her friends, she put her heart into her works and said, "I'm going to spin so much thread by the grace of this worm that I'll never be poor again." She spun what she had brought, and if she had more with her, she could have spun that too. She took the thread home, and her mother was so pleased with her daughter that she felt she was in heaven. Every morning the girl fed the worm a piece of apple, and however much cotton there was, the girl magically spun it into thread. This went on until one day her mother and father said to their clever daughter, "You spin so much that it seems as though you've taken a fairy as your sister." But the lovely child quickly answered her mother, "It's from this apple, and this little worm that was hidden in it." Then she showed her parents the marvelous worm and explained everything to them. Haftvad took all this as a good omen, and as his prospects seemed to brighten every day, he stopped worrying about his own work. He talked only about the good fortune brought by the worm, and how the worm had renewed his luck. They didn't neglect to look after the worm, but gave it good, nourishing food. The worm grew plump and strong. Its head and its back became splendid and formidable. The spindle case was now too small for its body, and from one end to the other its skin was like a black musk with a saffron-colored pattern on it. Haftvad made a fine black chest for it to live in. Now, no discussion about civic affairs could go forward in the town without Haftvad. He and his 7 sons became powerful, respected citizens. But there was a nobleman in the town, a proud man, who had his own followers, and he looked for some excuse to take his commoners' wealth away from him. Haftvad was afraid and stole out of the town, leaving his 7 sons there. Whenever he went to complain of their situation, and soon a group of men, young and old, had gathered around him. Haftvad was liberal with his gold, and soon he had an army, which made its way to his sons, determined to fight on his behalf. The noise of trumpets was heard throughout Kalgan, and the army attacked with lances, swords, and arrows. Haftvad fought bravely at the head of his men, took the town, and killed the noblemen who had been harassing him. A great deal of wealth and jewels came into his possessions. Men flocked to him, and he left Kagram and went into the mountains. There, on a summit, he built a fortress with an iron door for his followers. It was a place of pleasure and repose, but also a place that could withstand a siege. A stream there flowed into the fortress, and around the whole area he built a wall so high that its summit was invisible. Meanwhile, the worm had grown too big for its chest, and so they made a stone cistern inside the fortress, and when the air had sufficiently warmed the stone and mortar, they very gently placed the worm inside it. Every morning the worm's keeper ran from Haftvad and fed the worm with rice, which its swollen body soon disposed of. After 5 years of this, the worm was as massive as an elephant. The fortunate girl still looked after the worm with Haftvad commanded their armies. A vizier and a scribe waited on the worm, and now it was fed on milk and honey. Haftvad was in charge of the fortress and decided all matters that came before him. He now had an army, a counselor, a chancellor for his court, everything, in fact, that pertained to a king and his armies controlled the land of Kerman and the Sea of China. Haftwad's 7 sons each commanded 10,000 men, and they had wealth and arms at their disposal. If any king marched against them, as soon as his soldiers heard the tale of the worm, they lost heart, and the army broke up. Haftwad's fortress became so renowned that even the winds of heaven did not dare to blow about it. And here is where I end my tale for today. But I'll be back tomorrow with more tales, many more tales. Until then, my friends,